The nutrient dispensers aboard the Traverse Meridian had chosen the worst possible moment to fail, which is to say they'd failed at all. Machinery, in the experience of the six-person crew currently orbiting a thoroughly unremarkable brown dwarf system, typically demonstrated better timing. Or perhaps the machinery had simply demonstrated the only timing it knew, catastrophic and inconvenient, and the crew had been fortunate enough until now to avoid learning this lesson at 0600 hours on a Tuesday equivalent, 3 months into a mineral survey expedition with 4 months remaining. Keswick stood before the main dispenser panel in the galley, their triple-jointed fingers moving across the diagnostic display with the kind of precise irritation that suggested they were restraining themselves from simply hitting it. The ether navigator's chromatic skin had shifted to a dull orange, which anyone who'd spent more than a week with them recognized as the color of profound annoyance intersecting with genuine concern. Cascading failure from the ion scrubber power fluctuation, Keswick announced, their voice carrying the clicking harmonics that made all ether speech sound vaguely percussive. Everything routed through the primary distribution network is offline. That includes all 4 nutrient dispensers. Vrain, the mole engineer, had already opened the access panel beneath the secondary unit and had inserted their entire upper body into the mechanism, a feat possible only because mole upper bodies were considerably more flexible than most species found comfortable to observe. Their muffled voice emerged from inside the machinery, burned relays in the converter. "I can smell the oxidation. 6 hours minimum for replacement, assuming we don't find additional damage once I get the panels off." The rest of the crew absorbed this information according to their various biologies and temperaments. Schenkt, the Drexian geologist, released a low whistle that sounded like wind through a narrow canyon. Their species could survive days without food, so this was inconvenience rather than crisis. Palamon and Jessa, the 2 other mole on the crew, exchanged glances that suggested a silent conversation was occurring through the pheromone exchange, visible only in certain light spectrums. Mole needed regular caloric intake. 6 hours would be uncomfortable. Cormac Vey stood near the observation port with a ceramic mug in his hands, watching this unfold with the expression of someone observing a chemical reaction proceed exactly as predicted. He'd made his coffee 20 minutes earlier, before the dispensers failed, using his personal brewing setup, a small collection of equipment he maintained independently of ship systems for reasons the crew had stopped questioning after the first month. Humans, they'd learned, had peculiar relationships with specific consumables and preferred preparing certain things themselves even when perfectly adequate synthesized versions existed. He took a sip, said nothing, and continued watching. The human had earned a reputation over the past 3 months as the odd quiet one. He performed his duties as the crew's secondary geologist with methodical competence, filed reports that were thorough to the point of excess, and had a habit of asking strange questions during meals about food preferences, preparation traditions, and metabolic requirements. Most of the crew had assumed this was simply human curiosity. Their species was known for collecting information with the indiscriminate enthusiasm of a magnetic field collecting iron filings. Now, as Keswick's skin deepened to a burnt umber and Vrain emerged from the dispenser trailing diagnostic leads, Cormac set down his mug with a soft click against the metal counter. "Does the ship have a working heat source independent of the dispensers?" he asked. 6 heads turned toward him with varying degrees of confusion. Vrain's facial tendrils contracted in thought. "The auxiliary galley plasma range, it's on a separate power circuit for emergency rations, but we don't carry those anymore. Regulations changed 2 years ago. Nutrient dispensers are considered more reliable." The irony of this statement hung in the air like stale carbon dioxide. Cormac nodded slowly. "And raw provisions. Does the ship have any actual ingredients? There was a pause. The concept seemed to require translation, not because of language barriers, but because of fundamental category confusion. Ingredients implied assembly. Food for most of the represented species arrived in final form, synthesized to exact biological specifications, or prepared in dedicated facilities before shipping. The idea of combining raw materials into edible compounds aboard ship was roughly equivalent to suggesting they smelt their own hull plating. There are unmarked containers, Kiesik said slowly. From the last supply stop at Gant Station, surplus items loaded into environmental storage. I signed off on them but didn't examine the contents. They were listed as organic miscellany and passed contamination screening. Cormac's expression shifted into something that might have been satisfaction. I noticed those during inventory last week. Unfertilized ether protein spheres, mole grain concentrate, some containers of refined plant lipids and carbohydrate powder. No one had plans to use them. Because no one uses those things, Palamon interjected, their tone suggesting this should be obvious. That's like having raw ore and a manual smelting kit when you have perfectly functional fabricators. Except the fabricators are broken, Cormac observed mildly. I could prepare something. If there's interest. The silence that followed this suggestion carried multiple layers of uncertainty. Vrain's tendrils performed a complex knot, the mole equivalent of skeptical consideration. Kiesik's skin flickered through several colors before settling on pale yellow, which meant they were genuinely thinking about it rather than reflexively dismissing it. You can make food, Kiesik said carefully. From components, most humans can manage basic preparations. It's a common skill set. Cormac's tone suggested he was describing something as mundane as changing an air filter. What would you make? Schenkt asked, their harmonic voice carrying genuine curiosity. Pancakes, probably. The word dropped into the conversation and lay there like a rock on a specimen tray. It didn't translate properly through the shipboard linguistic database. The closest equivalents ranged from flat grain product to heated carbohydrate disk to something that translated roughly as starch mistake. It's a human breakfast food, Cormac clarified, simple in concept, adaptable in execution. 6 hours was a long time to wait with nothing. The mole were already looking uncomfortable, their metabolisms beginning the early stages of caloric deficit. Even Kiesik, whose wither biology was more flexible, would be notably irritable by the time Vrain completed repairs. You're certain these items are safe for cross-species consumption? Kiesik asked, their navigator's instinct for risk assessment asserting itself. I'll verify before preparation. If there's any toxicity concern, I won't proceed. Another pause. Hunger and pragmatism waged a quiet war against skepticism and unfamiliarity. Hunger won, as it generally does. Proceed, Kiesik said, making it formal. But if this causes medical issues, I'm noting it in the log. Noted, Cormac agreed. He rinsed his mug, set it in the cleaning rack, and headed toward environmental storage. The corridors of the Traverse Meridian were consistent with civilian research vessels operating in the outer survey zones, functional, well-maintained, and utterly devoid of personality. Cormac moved through them with the efficiency of someone who'd spent 3 months learning every shortcut, every access panel, every place where the corridor narrowed just enough to require turning sideways. He'd mapped the entire ship during the first 2 weeks, not because anyone asked him to, but because understanding one's environment was simply what one did when confined to a small space for extended periods. Environmental storage occupied a section of the lower deck where temperature and atmospheric composition could be precisely controlled for sensitive cargo. The unmarked containers sat in locker 17, exactly where they'd been since Gaunt Station. Cormac retrieved 5 of them, not all, because one didn't deplete resources without confirming viability first, and made his way back to the galley carrying approximately 20 kilograms of supplies that the rest of the crew had forgotten existed. When he returned, Vrain had completely disassembled the primary nutrient dispenser and was elbow-deep in its mechanical entrails. Keswick was reviewing the repair schedule on a handheld display. Palumon, Jesser and Schenkt had dispersed to their duty stations, presumably deciding that watching machinery fail was less interesting than their actual work. Cormac set the containers on the counter and began examining their contents under the ship's spectrum analyzer, a piece of equipment normally used for mineral composition studies but perfectly adequate for analyzing protein structures, carbohydrate chains, and potential allergens. He cross-referenced his findings with the xenobiological database, checking each substance against the metabolic profiles of every species aboard. The ether protein spheres were interesting. Unfertilized reproductive cells, effectively with a chemical composition that behaved somewhat like Earth chicken eggs, but with a higher lipid content and a triple helix protein structure that would require lower cooking temperatures. Usable. The mole grain concentrate was essentially concentrated carbohydrate derived from a plant analogous to wheat, but with a different gluten structure, or rather a gluten-adjacent compound that would provide binding properties without the exact same chemistry. It needed hydration and time to activate properly. Also usable. The refined plant lipids were straightforward fats with a surprisingly high smoke point. The carbohydrate powder was a simple sugar analog. "What are you planning?" Vrain asked, emerging from the dispenser with a handful of scorched components. "Pancakes," Cormac repeated. "Probably. You keep saying that word. It's a flatbread preparation, leavened chemically or mechanically, cooked on a heated surface. The basic principle is combining proteins, carbohydrates, and fats in specific ratios, then applying heat to denature the proteins and gelatinize the starches." Vrain's tendrils performed another complicated pattern. "That sounds like applied chemistry. Most cooking is..." Keswick approached the counter, studying the containers with the careful attention they usually reserved for navigation charts. "These ingredients can produce something edible. If combined and heated correctly, yes, for all species aboard. That's what I'm verifying." Cormac gestured at the spectrum analyzer. "The protein spheres are compatible with ether, mole, and human biology. Drexian metabolism handles almost anything organic. The grain concentrate shows no allergen flags. I'll need to adjust ratios to account for different digestive requirements, but the fundamental process should work." "Should," Keswick repeated. "Nothing's certain until tested. But the probability of success is reasonably high." This was apparently sufficient. Keswick returned to their display, and Vrain returned to the disassembled dispenser, and Cormac began setting up his workspace with the systematic precision that defined his approach to everything. He located mixing implements in the sample preparation locker, designed for combining chemical compounds, but perfectly serviceable after sterilization in the cleaning unit. He found measurement tools calibrated for mineral analysis that would work equally well for cooking ratios. The auxiliary plasma range occupied a corner of the galley that hadn't been used since the ship left dock. Cormac activated it and ran a quick diagnostic to confirm even heat distribution. Then he began the actual work. The mole grain concentrate came first. He measured out a quantity, added water in a 3-to-1 ratio based on the rehydration specifications in the container's technical documentation, and set it aside. The grains needed 15 minutes to fully absorb the liquid and activate their binding properties. Rushing this step would produce a paste instead of a batter. While that hydrated, he examined the ether protein spheres. They came in a suspension fluid that he drained off, leaving behind pale blue orbs about the size of a human thumb. He cracked 3 of them into a clean container. They broke differently than chicken eggs, the interior separating into distinct layers rather than mixing naturally. He'd need to manually combine them. He whisked using a sterilized stirring rod until the layers integrated into a uniform consistency. The plant lipids presented an interesting challenge. At room temperature, they'd formed a semi-crystalline structure, solid enough to require cutting. Heat would liquefy them. He placed a small quantity in a metal container and set it on the edge of the plasma range where ambient heat would melt it gradually. Kisik had moved closer, watching this process with what might have been fascination or might have been continued skepticism. Their skin had shifted to a neutral green. "You've done this before," Kisik observed. "Made pancakes?" "Yes, made pancakes from ether protein spheres and mole grain concentrate." "No, but the underlying principles are consistent. You're treating this like an experiment." "It is an experiment." Hypothesis: these ingredients can be combined in ratios that produce an edible result. Method: combine and heat. Test: we eat it and see if anyone dies. That's a concerning final step. "I'll sample first," Cormac said. Safety protocols. Vrain had stopped working on the dispenser and was watching now too. "How do you know the ratios?" Traditional pancake ratios are approximately 2 parts dry to 1 part wet by volume, with modifications based on protein content and desired thickness. "I'm adjusting for the higher lipid content in the ether spheres and the different binding properties of the mole grain. Best estimate: 3 parts hydrated grain to 2 parts protein mixture, with a small amount of melted lipid and sugar for palatability." "You're guessing," Vrain said. "I'm making an educated estimate based on known chemical principles and past experience." "Which is what engineering is." Vrain's tendrils twisted in what Cormac had learned to recognize as mole laughter. By now the grain had hydrated properly. Cormac combined it with the protein mixture, added the melted lipid and a conservative amount of sugar, and mixed until everything integrated into a thick, pourable consistency. The result looked approximately correct, similar to pancake batter he'd made on Earth, allowing for the pale blue tint from the ether proteins and the slightly darker grain color. "That looks biological," Keswick said dubiously. "Most food is synthesized nutrients, don't look like they used to be alive. This used to be alive. That's why it's nutritious." Keswick's skin flickered orange briefly, then settled back to green. Cormac poured a small test portion onto the plasma range, which he'd adjusted to medium heat, lower than he'd use for Earth-based pancakes, accounting for the protein sphere's lower denaturation temperature. The batter spread across the heated surface, bubbles began forming along the edges, and the mixture started to solidify. So far, the chemistry was cooperating. The smell was unexpected. Synthesized nutrients had no real aroma. They were delivered in standardized packaging and consumed without ceremony. This preparation was releasing compounds into the air, triggering olfactory responses. Not unpleasant, exactly, but distinctly organic in a way that the galley hadn't smelled in 3 months. Palamon reappeared in the doorway, followed by Jessa. "What is that?" Palamon asked. "Food preparation," Cormac said, sliding a flat implement under the cooking batter and flipping it in one smooth motion. The other side was golden brown, with slight caramelization. "Exactly correct." "It smells like something is oxidizing," Jessa observed. "That's the Maillard reaction. Amino acids, and reducing sugars undergoing heat-catalyzed transformation. It's normal. For humans. For chemistry. The first pancake finished cooking. Cormac transferred it to a plate, let it cool for 30 seconds, then cut a small portion and ate it himself. The texture was slightly denser than Earth pancakes. The flavor had subtle mineral notes from the mole grain, and the ether proteins provided a richness that regular eggs didn't quite match. Structurally sound. Temperature appropriate. No immediate digestive concerns. He cut additional small portions and offered them to Keswick and Vrain. Sample. Check for adverse reactions before I make full portions. Both of them regarded the offered food with the caution typically reserved for unknown chemical compounds. Keswick took their piece first, examined it thoroughly, then consumed it in a single bite. Their skin went through several rapid color changes, purple, orange, yellow, green, before settling on a pale blue that indicated thoughtful consideration. The texture is unusual, Keswick said, but not unpleasant. The flavor is more complex than synthesized nutrients. I detect the protein spheres, that's familiar. The grain component is foreign but acceptable. Vrain tried theirs next, chewing slowly. There are mineral notes. Iron, magnesium, from the grain, Cormac confirmed. The mole plant species concentrates those from soil. I find it philosophically interesting, Vrain said, which was the most positive assessment Cormac had heard them give anything. The transformation of components into a unified result through applied heat. It's engineering on a molecular level. That's exactly what it is, Cormac agreed. Palamon and Jessa tried samples next. Schenkt arrived shortly after, drawn by curiosity, or smell, or the simple fact that everyone else had gathered in one location. Each species had slightly different reactions. Schenkt found it bland but acceptable. Palamon wanted more geometric consistency in the shape. Jessa thought it needed additional salt, but none reported adverse effects. I'll make full portions, Cormac announced. Preferences. This question opened an unexpected avenue of conversation. Keswick explained that Yitha culture had specific taboos about mixing proteins and grains in the same vessel, something from their evolutionary history, involving a food poisoning incident that had become ritualized into custom. Consumption at the same meal was acceptable, but the items needed to be separated during preparation and serving. Cormac nodded and adjusted his plan. He'd make 2 variants, one with reduced grain content for the Yitha. Vrain mentioned that Mol had cultural associations with geometric food presentation, patterns and symmetries carried meaning in their communication systems. A meal arranged properly was as much a statement as a meal consumed for nutrition. What symmetries are preferred? Cormac asked, already considering how to shape the pancakes. Radial for communal meals, bilateral for individual portions, Vrain said. 6-fold symmetry is traditional, but 4-fold is acceptable. I can work with that. The conversation expanded from there. Jessa explained that younger Mol experienced food differently than mature ones. Their taste receptors developed in stages, and certain flavors were imperceptible until later biological phases. Palimon described how Mol food traditions involved competitive preparation displays, with entire festivals dedicated to presenting increasingly elaborate geometric arrangements. Schenkt talked about Drexian food being primarily about mineral content rather than flavor. They could taste metal concentrations directly and found most organic food somewhat monotonous. Cormac listened more than he spoke, absorbing information with the same careful attention he gave to geological surveys. He asked clarifying questions. He made mental notes about preferences and restrictions. The narrator, observing this scene, might note that this was Cormac's actual expertise, not pancake preparation specifically, but the patience to learn systems, whether geological strata or cultural requirements. He'd spent 3 months studying his crewmates the way he studied mineral deposits, carefully, without judgment, looking for patterns and connections. Now that accumulated knowledge became practical, he established a production rhythm: mix, pour, flip, plate. For the ether, he made thinner versions with lower grain content, cooking them at slightly higher heat to achieve the crispness they preferred. For the mole, he used a metal ring to create perfect circles, then arranged them on plates in radial patterns, 6 pancakes per plate, positioned at 60-degree intervals. For Schenkt, he added a mineral supplement powder that the ship's medical bay used for Drexian dietary needs, giving the pancakes a faint metallic taste they could actually perceive. For Palimol's request for additional salt, he incorporated a small amount of the sodium-based compound used in the ship's electrolyte supplements. The galley filled with continued conversation. Vrain had abandoned the dispenser repair entirely. There was nothing they could do until replacement parts finished fabricating anyway, and was discussing the thermodynamic properties of different cooking methods. Keswick was explaining ether navigation rituals that involved communal meals before dangerous maneuvers. Palimon and Jessa were debating whether circular pancakes or hexagonal ones would be more aesthetically meaningful. Cormac worked steadily, turning out portions with mechanical consistency. This wasn't dramatic. This wasn't a bold human innovation saving the day through superior ingenuity. This was maintenance, noticing a problem, having the knowledge to address it, and the patience to execute properly. The crew's tension from the morning had dissolved entirely, replaced by something approaching comfortable normalcy. They were talking about things that had nothing to do with broken machinery or survey schedules, facilitated by the simple fact of being fed. Eventually everyone had a plate. The crew gathered around the central table, not at their usual scattered stations, but in actual proximity to each other. They ate. The pancakes weren't optimized nutrition calibrated to exact biological specifications. They weren't the peak efficiency that synthesized food represented. But they were warm, they were adequate, and they'd been prepared with attention to individual needs. This has a different quality than dispensed nutrients, Keswick observed between bites. Not superior necessarily, but more present. The preparation time creates investment, Vrain suggested. There's psychological weight to food that required effort. Or it's just warm, Jessa said. Synthesized nutrients are room temperature. Temperature affects perception. The geometric arrangement does enhance the experience, Palimon admitted. I thought it was purely symbolic, but there's actual satisfaction in the visual symmetry. The conversation continued around topics of food culture, preparation traditions, and the various ways different species had solved the problem of nutrition. Cormac ate his own portion quietly, listening. He'd made his pancakes traditionally, no special modifications, just the baseline preparation he'd learned years ago, in circumstances he didn't particularly feel like discussing. Did you learn this skill for space travel? Schenkt asked him directly. Cormac shook his head. Just something I knew from before. Basic competency, like changing a filter or recalibrating a sensor. Humans had to be adaptable with food preparation for most of our history because we couldn't synthesize what we needed. You learned to work with available resources, or you didn't eat. The crew absorbed this information, adding it to their accumulating knowledge about human evolutionary history and cultural development. A species that had needed to be flexible because they lacked better options. A species that had turned that necessity into retained skills even after better options became available. 4 hours after Cormac had started cooking, Vrain's handheld display chimed with a notification from engineering. The nutrient dispenser repairs were complete ahead of schedule. The fabricator had produced replacement components faster than estimated, and the engineering team had managed to bypass damaged circuits entirely. Synthesized food was available again. No one immediately moved to get any. They finished their pancakes first. Eventually, the galley emptied as crew members returned to their duties. Surveys didn't pause for meals, and the Traverse Meridian had a schedule to maintain. Keswick headed back to navigation. Vrain gathered their tools and went to complete the dispenser reinstallation. Palamon, Jessa, and Schenk dispersed to their respective stations. Cormac remained behind to clean. Not because it was assigned to him, not because anyone expected it, but because he'd created the mess and would therefore address it. He washed the implements, returned the remaining ingredients to environmental storage, reset the plasma range to standby. The galley returned to its normal state, clean, functional, ready for the next scheduled meal from dispensers that now worked perfectly. Keswick paused at the doorway before leaving. They turned back, their skin shifting to the deep blue that indicated formal communication. They performed the Ither gesture of gratitude, a triple click and a specific head tilt, and said, "Thank you for the provision." Cormac nodded, acknowledgement. "You're welcome." After the navigator left, Cormac poured himself another coffee from his personal setup and returned to his usual position by the observation port. The brown dwarf system continued its rotation below, unremarkable and appropriately catalogued. They'd be here another week, running mineral surveys on the asteroid belt, then moving on to the next system on their route. The Traverse Meridian would continue its mission for another 4 months. The crew would consume thousands more meals, almost all of them synthesized and optimized to exact specifications. This morning would become a minor anecdote, referenced occasionally. Remember that time the human made those flat grain products. Strange business, that but ultimately filed away as an anomaly in an otherwise routine expedition. But something had shifted, subtly. The crew understood now that Cormac had been paying attention to them, to their preferences, to their cultural requirements, to the small details that made up daily existence in a confined space. They knew that human adaptability wasn't about dramatic gestures or superior technology or overwhelming force. It was about noticing what was needed and having a repertoire broad enough to address it. It was about being comfortable with improvisation that came from preparation, not panic. The dispensers would fail again, eventually, different system, different problem, entropy's patient work on all complex machinery. When they did, the crew would remember that solutions sometimes emerged from unexpected sources, from knowledge that seemed irrelevant until circumstances changed. They'd remember that basic competency for one species might look like specialized expertise to another, and that the human who asked all those strange questions about food preferences might have been collecting data for exactly this kind of situation. Cormac finished his coffee and opened his geological survey notes, returning to the analysis of mineral composition in the approaching asteroid belt. Preliminary scans suggested interesting deposits of rare earth analogues in the larger specimens, worth detailed investigation when they arrived in 3 days. He made annotations, cross-referenced spectral data, and prepared his recommendations for survey priority. The pancakes were gone, the galley was clean, and the ship continued its trajectory through the deep. Everything was exactly as routine as it should be, except now the crew understood that routine for humans included being ready for when it wasn't. That preparation looked like knowing how to combine unfamiliar ingredients into adequate nutrition. That adaptation looked like adjusting recipes for cultural taboos and geometric preferences. That resilience looked like treating a broken dispenser not as a crisis, but as an opportunity to apply different knowledge to the same fundamental problem. Above them, the brown dwarf burned with its quiet fusion, converting hydrogen to helium with the patient chemistry of stellar processes. Below them, asteroids drifted in their calculated orbits, accumulating minerals through billions of years of cosmic collision. And inside the ship, a human geologist reviewed survey data, while his crewmates returned to their duties, all of them fed and functional because someone had noticed that sometimes the solution to a problem was less complicated than the problem itself. Sometimes it was just pancakes.